Welcome back to Unjust Crimes. My name is Michelle, and this is part 2 of the unsolved murders of Barry and Honey Sherman. If you haven't watched part 1, I do recommend that you go back and do that first. On Thursday, December 21st, 2017, about 7,500 people attended Barry and Honey Sherman's funeral, including Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, Ontario Premier Kathleen, Ontario Health Minister Eric Hoskins, and Toronto Mayor John Tory. You can actually view the funeral on YouTube, well, at least clips of it. Maybe you can find the entire service if you are interested. It was live streamed, but I only watched a few clips. The Shermans' only son, Jonathan, paid tribute to his parents, saying they were, quote, like yin and yang, they completed a circle that encompassed everything important about what it means to be human. Neither one perfect, but together wholly balanced and exceptional. The impact the Shermans had on those around them could be heard in the words of those who spoke at the funeral. For instance, Jack Kay, with his voice breaking numerous times, reminisced about the 35 years of both a business and a personal relationship with Barry, a man that he considered a brother. He said, quote, Barry was just a regular guy. He was kind of a teddy bear in real life, but with a mind like a steel trap and the stubbornness of a bull. He changed my life, and I'm so very grateful to have shared those years with him. And the memorials poured in from family, friends, and colleagues. Joel Ulster, another one of Barry's best friends, who called himself Barry's oldest friend, described Barry not only as, quote, the smartest person, but much more importantly, he had the biggest heart. By Friday, December 15, 2017, speaking to reporters outside the Sherman home, Detective Brandon Price told reporters that while the deaths were considered suspicious, they were not yet being treated as homicides. He said that the police were still trying to, quote, determine if there is foul play involved or not, and at this point we cannot say 100% with certainty if there is or there is not. Detective Price also confirmed that there were no signs of forced entry into the home and that police were not searching for any outstanding suspects. Now, reporters took this as code for murder-suicide or double suicide. And sure enough, by that night, police sources were telling the media that the police were considering this a murder-suicide and that Barry had killed Honey and then himself. Meanwhile, the Sherman family, who were gathered at Alexandra's house, started to get wind of these rumors, and they were upset because they thought it was a ridiculous theory and very irresponsible of the police to suggest such a thing. They knew Barry did not kill Honey and then himself. Mary, Honey's best friend and sister, was there at Alexandra's when the police showed up that night to speak with the family. She decided to follow the detective to the police station, and she was taken into an interview room, and that's when the whispers were swirling, and Mary wanted the police to know two things. First, murder-suicide was a ridiculous theory, and second, they needed to follow the money. Quote, everyone wanted to get near Barry and Honey because of their wealth. Now, in response to these swirling rumors, less than 24 hours after the Shermans' bodies were found, the Sherman children hired lawyer Brian Greenspan, one of the most prominent defense lawyers in Canada, to put together a private investigative team to work the case parallel to the police's investigation. Now, I have to say that I have not seen anywhere where the police explicitly stated murder-suicide, but it was definitely implied. Family and friends were getting the strong feeling that this was how the police were leaning too, because early police interviews with those closest to the Shermans mainly consisted of questions about the couple's marriage, if there were any illnesses, how was their health, if there was any infidelity in the marriage, were they facing any financial issues, and so on and so forth. So basically, the police were implying that there must have been a reason for either a double suicide or a murder-suicide. Now, it has come out since that the police were aware in the early days of the investigation of a toxic email exchange between Barry and Honey. Not long before the murders took place, there was an email exchange where Barry told Honey that she had been abusive to him for more than 40 years, as well as the kids. Now, for all we know, the police may have had lots more of similar exchanges. Maybe the police did have lots of things that pointed to an unhappy marriage and tensions that maybe would have persuaded them to think that it was likely that this could have been a murder-suicide. But to be fair to the Toronto detectives, at no time did they ever publicly state that they believed this was a murder-suicide. But that's what police sources were telling the media. They were telling the media that the police were only looking into the murder of Honey. So in other words, they thought that Barry had killed Honey and then himself. And the Sherman children reacted and put out a statement saying that they felt it was irresponsible of the police to float this theory when no one in the family or their circle of friends thought it to be true. Now, the Shermans' autopsies were performed on the Sunday after the bodies were found by Dr. Michael Pickup, who was a junior pathologist at the office of the chief coroner in North Toronto, and he performed the autopsies with the police present. He did not reach a conclusion on the manner of death, and 3 theories were being considered: murder-suicide, double suicide, and double homicide. Dr. Pickup did make a determination, though, on the medical cause of death, which he determined was ligature neck compression, but he was not prepared to state with 100% certainty what caused that compression. You see, one of the issues that Dr. Pickup was struggling with was related to the hyoid bone in the Shermans' necks. They were both intact. A broken hyoid bone often occurs when someone is violently strangled, but not always. So the medical cause of death was released by the Toronto police to the public late Sunday night as ligature neck compression. And that was all that was said. The police had not made a determination as to the type of ligature, although the leather belts at the scene around the Shermans' necks were a strong candidate. Now, one of the first things of order for the private investigative team the Sherman children had hired was to have a second autopsy performed by a more experienced pathologist. So retired chief forensic pathologist for Ontario, Dr. David Chazon, performed this second autopsy on December 20th, which was the day before the funerals. Dr. Chazon had invited both Dr. Michael Pickup, the pathologist who did the first autopsies, and the Toronto police detectives who were working the case. The police declined, but Dr. Pickup did agree to go to these second autopsies. Also joining Dr. Chazon from the private team were 3 former Toronto homicide detectives. Now, the results from this second autopsy were drastically different from the first and concluded that the deaths were indeed homicides. Neither Barry nor Honey's hyoid bone was fractured, and Dr. Chazon wondered if that was why the police thought it was a murder-suicide. But as he had shown with research years before, a murder with a soft ligature could leave the hyoid bone intact. Dr. Chazon determined that while it was theoretically possible that one of the two had strangled the other and then staged the body, the other person could not have died by strangulation simply by looping the belt over the rail and sitting down. There would not be enough weight or downward force. Dr. Chazon also found that some sort of rope or plastic tie had bound the couple's wrists, but there were no ropes or ties near the bodies when they were found. Since the murders, the Toronto police had been searching the sewers, and during the second autopsy, those present wondered if the police were doing this to see if ropes or ties had been flushed down a toilet and into the sewer system. The junior pathologist, Dr. Pickup, had missed marks also on the Shermans' necks that indicated they were strangled with a thin ligature. Dr. Chazon determined the couple was strangled with something thin, possibly something like those long plastic cable ties, also possibly the same type of bindings that were used to bind their wrists, and not by the belts that hung them up by their necks. The more seasoned pathologist determined that the belts around the couple's necks were placed there after death and were used to stage their bodies in seated positions. No bindings, no cords, no straps were found at the crime scene. According to Dr. Chazon, Barry and Honey Sherman were murdered and their bodies were staged. Now, once his findings were presented to the private investigative team that the family had hired, they determined that Barry and Honey Sherman were killed in what looked like to them a professional contract killing. Someone had the Shermans murdered in a deliberate and apparently professional attack, and then staged the bodies to make it look like they had killed themselves or like one had killed the other. If the killers had struck on the Wednesday night and intended to make it look like a murder-suicide, one possible reason for doing that, the team decided, was to buy the killers time to escape, time to get rid of evidence, time to do whatever. Now, no DNA evidence was found at the crime scene, and nothing had been stolen from the home. Honey's purse was on a chair at the kitchen table by the side entrance that she came in, and it had $7,500 in her wallet. Clearly, this wasn't a robbery gone wrong. Now, the police had made a big deal of saying that there was no forced entry, and that may very well have been true, but I don't think it was as important as they made it sound, because first of all, the Shermans were well known for not even locking their doors. And sure enough, a side door leading out from the basement to a patio was unlocked when the real estate agent had arrived on that Friday morning. Moreover, the Shermans' private investigative team, who were all retired police homicide detectives, discovered that the front door lock was broken. The mechanism inside didn't work, and anyone could have easily gotten inside the house. The mechanisms inside the door could have been broken for all we know for years, and anyone with regular access to the home could have known this. Okay, so the murder-suicide theory clearly was wrong for all of the reasons I've just mentioned, but think about it. How could Barry have killed Honey then himself, and then gotten rid of all of the bindings and whatever else was used to strangle them. He couldn't. Also think about this. Their toxicology reports came back clean, other than their regular meds. Now, Barry was a pharmaceutical king. He could get his hands on anything that he wanted. If he was going to kill Honey and then himself, wouldn't he have just used drugs? Now, pretty much everything that I have read and watched about this case has made a big deal about how much the Toronto Police Services have fucked this case up. And I have to say, coming from what is out there, it really does seem that way. But just to be devil's advocate here for a second, first of all, we do not know everything that the police have. But there is something a little bit different that happened in this case that has allowed us to get a glimpse inside this investigation. So since 2018, Kevin Donovan of the Toronto Star has been arguing in court to have court documents unsealed in relation to the Sherman case. The Toronto Star says it's so that the troubled investigation can be scrutinized, and they have been successful in having some documents unsealed, starting in late 2020. Though, what has been unsealed is very heavily redacted. So much of what is public knowledge about this case stems from that, but keeping in mind, like I said, these documents are very heavily redacted. And I think that's important to remember. So we still do not know very much about the investigation, which in my opinion is the way that it should be. The last thing we need is information getting out that could jeopardize the investigation. So nothing about the theories the police are working or anybody that they consider suspects are public knowledge. So while I was researching this case, I really tried to keep an open mind about the police and how they have handled this case. And I really tried not to follow the narrative that's out there, the narrative that the police have really screwed this up. Now that narrative very well could be true, I don't know. But until we know that, I'm trying to keep an open mind that police have been doing their best on this case, and just because we don't see any movement doesn't mean they've screwed up. And I have often wondered why the police let the public and the family think that they were going with murder-suicide theory. I mean, clearly these were murders, and these were experienced homicide detectives. So I find that hard to believe that they were that close-minded, unless of course there was a lot of information that we don't know, coupled with those inconclusive autopsies. It's possible. Then I came across this quote from one of Barry's close friends and business associates, Frank D'Angelo, and I have to wonder if he hit the nail on the head. Quote, "The Toronto police know what they are doing. I believe the cops did that on purpose to create chatter, to get whoever did it to not know what they were thinking." I can't help but wonder if he's right. Maybe police were not stuck on murder-suicide at all, and maybe they wanted the killers to think that so that the killers would mess up or get sloppy or whatever. Whatever the case, 6 weeks after the murders, lead investigator Susan Gomes announced that the police had sufficient evidence to describe these deaths as targeted double homicides. Again, I do not know why it took 6 weeks to say this. Police did say in those 6 weeks that they had been investigating all possibilities, such as double suicide, murder-suicide, and double homicide, and had reached the conclusion that it was a case of double homicide. I think it's very likely that police were looking into all scenarios, and I say that for a couple of reasons. Firstly, reportedly the Toronto police had a squad car that was parked for several weeks at the property that backed onto the Sherman's property. Why would they do that if they thought it was murder-suicide? I think it's possible that they were hoping that the killers might come back to the house for whatever reason. And that tells me that they weren't as close-minded as the media would like us to think. Also, there were reports of the police scouring the sewer systems after the murders, and there were reports of the police walking around the roof of the Sherman house, because the Sherman house had been broken into I'm not sure how long before the murders, and the police believe that one of the ways they accessed the home was through the skylights. So they were on the roof examining all of the skylights and the roof. So why would they do any of that though, if they thought they were looking at a murder-suicide? I think that they were looking at all scenarios. Now, the Toronto Star claims that their, quote, explosive story about the second autopsy finding the deaths as homicides is what forced the police to hold a press conference to announce this as double murder. Do I believe that? Maybe, but probably not for the reasons that the Toronto Star would like you to believe. I think that the police felt that because the Toronto Star had put that story out there, that they had to get ahead of the gossip before it got out of hand and possibly jeopardize their case. And who knows? Maybe it was just a coincidence and the police's announcement had nothing to do with the Star's story. But I really doubt that. I do think that the story did force the police's hand in coming forward. So what is one to make of the staging of the bodies? It means something. What? we do not know, but I do believe what the private investigators suspected is true, that the killer, or killers, staged the scene as a possible murder-suicide to throw cops off and buy themselves time. So reportedly, the unsealed documents show that the police were interviewing those closest to the Shermans in those first 6 weeks, but they weren't asking for alibis. But I also want to add here that the unsealed documents also revealed that the police relied on cell phone records to verify alibis for some people. Whether or not that was good enough, I cannot say, but this is what the police documents say. Quote, "The tracking and transmission data for the phone numbers of these individuals have all assisted in providing likely alibis for the persons of interest. The tracking and transmission data have assisted in dispelling investigative theories involving the following people, but who those people are is redacted and blacked out in the document." Now, something that police were up against and are still up against in the Sherman case was a deal that was struck between the Apotex lawyers from the Goodman's firm and Ontario government lawyers. The law firm for Apotex asserted privilege, saying that Apotex was a big, complicated company with many trade secrets. The government agreed. So this deal gave the Apotex lawyers the right to determine what police could and could not see. But here's a chilling piece of information. To this day, police still do not have everything. And I have to wonder how much this hindered the case. Like maybe if the police had access to everything, how do we know that this case wouldn't have been solved already? Police did get access to Honey's phone within 5 days, but it would be a full month before they got Barry's devices or were allowed to look through any of his files. And then when they did, what files they were allowed to look at was handpicked by Barry's lawyers and the trustees of his estate and his family. So at the couple's home on Old Colony Road, police had found Barry's BlackBerry and Honey's iPhone. They had also found a couple of iPads in the master bedroom and a desktop computer. At Apotex, in Barry's office, they found stacks of files and his desktop computer. Like I said, they were not able to go through any of Barry's stuff right away, and when they were, what they could see was very limited. Now, the family and the trustees of Barry's estate wanted the estate sealed. They said that they felt that those that were in control of and those who were beneficiaries of could be targets. So the estate of Barry Sherman was sealed until the Toronto Star fought to have the documents unsealed, which they were eventually unsealed. So meanwhile, to this end, when talking about Barry's estate, the Toronto homicide detectives have pursued a financial motive in the murder investigation, and a detective said in a court hearing to have some documents unsealed that the estate of Barry Sherman, and who receives and does not receive money in accordance with Barry's will, is embedded in the police investigation. Make of that what you will, but I think it's possible that Barry's will may very well hold the key to these murders. But what does that mean exactly? Well, I don't know. Could it mean that whoever killed the couple was either set to receive a lot of money, or whoever killed the couple was set to receive none? It could be something completely different that I cannot see. So in the case of Barry Sherman, he had a lot of enemies, from business associates to rival drug companies, even some family members. And Barry was involved in a couple of long-running, very public conflicts. According to a law professor at the University of Ottawa, quote, Apotex was the most litigious pharmaceutical company in Canada and probably the most litigious company, period. It's fair to observe the way Barry, did business, he would have had many enemies. Canadians pay some of the highest prices in the world for generic drugs. He was unethical in business, his drugs were overpriced and gouged Canadians. And Barry wasn't oblivious to the fact that he had made many enemies within the pharmaceutical industry and openly wondered why one of them hadn't hired someone to kill him yet. As he told Jeffrey Robinson in 2001 for his book, Prescription Games, Money, Ego, and Power Inside the Pharmaceutical Industry, Barry acknowledged the long-running conflict between Apotex and the major pharmaceutical companies over drug patents, saying, quote, the branded drug companies hate us. They have private investigators on us all the time. The thought once came to my mind, why didn't they just hire someone to knock me off? Starting from the very beginning of his business in pharmaceuticals, Barry would outsmart his opponents by thinking further ahead, recognizing and exploiting legal loopholes, and being willing to take risks. Now, all that being said, lawsuits apparently are a cost of doing business in the generic drug industry, but Apotex was known for going further than its competitors in its willingness to challenge patents. So just to give one example of how shrewd Barry was in business, which I did briefly mention, was when he sold Empire Labs in 1970. 1972. So he had bought this company with his best friend, Joel Ulster. When the company received an offer for Empire Labs, the buyers had required a non-compete clause in the sale contract, preventing then the shareholders from going into the drug business for 5 years. Barry, however, was not a shareholder, allowing Barry to sneak back into the same business and found Apotex the following year. This wrangling was a point of pride for him, as he boasted in his memoir, quote, "This worked out exactly as I hoped." That's just one example of how shrewd and underhanded Barry was in business. Now, records at the Federal Court and Federal Court of Appeal alone show that there were more than 1,200 cases involving Apotex. But Barry liked to characterize his fights with the patented drug makers as being in the interest of the average people that were struggling to afford brand-name drugs, going so far as accusing the multinational drug companies of raping Canadians' healthcare system. Barry also knew that his competitors would stop at almost nothing to undermine him. And for instance, there was this former undercover fraud detective with London's Scotland Yard, who later worked as a private investigator, that confirmed that a big pharma company had once hired him to target Barry Sherman. Quote, "I met Sherman a couple of times in the mid-90s, having worked my way up the Apotex management structure whilst posing undercover as an international pharmaceutical procurement agent looking to buy product. And he said that at this time the pharmaceutical industry had some very dark corners." Supposedly, there was this discreet meeting in a European pub in the 90s between this private investigator, another private investigator, and a middleman who worked for Big Pharma. And this middleman was very anxious to have the thorn in the side Barry out of the drug business. So 2 of these investigators had just returned from Canada, where they had staked out Apotex. And to get up close, they had dressed as workers holding clipboards at the company's loading bays and eating hot dogs with employees at picnic tables. But the middleman was grasping for more, asking questions like, what's his sexual preference? Could we get him hooked up with little girls, or even underage boys? Though there was never any indication that Barry was interested in such things. But the middleman for the big pharma company was eager to take Barry out of the game. The private investigator recalled, quote, "Whatever it takes." And it was also suggested that if there was no basis for a sex sting, that the middleman even considered setting Barry up with a half kilo of cocaine in his trunk. The private investigator didn't want anything to do with this and says that whatever further ideas the middleman had for dirty tricks, it didn't include him, although the private investigator did say that he retained an image of Barry as a troublesome and aggressive businessman. Now that's just one minor example of how far some of his rivals may have gone to get rid of him. Another long-standing feud that Barry had was in the 1990s with a hematologist by the name of Dr. Nancy Oliveri at Ontario's Hospital for Sick Kids, over negative research results related to one of the company's drugs. Dr. Oliveri was working on an Apotex-funded clinical trial into the effectiveness of the drug deferiprone in treating people with a blood disorder called thalassemia. She became concerned, though, about evidence that suggested the drug wasn't as effective for some patients. She told Apotex and the Research Ethics Board monitoring the study that she wanted to inform the patients about this risk. Apotex threatened to sue her if she did, but she went ahead and she informed the patients and published her findings regardless. Barry was later recorded calling her, quote, "nuts" when he discussed the case with 60 Minutes. And the full power of Barry Sherman's immense wealth was launched against Dr. Oliveri, who was eventually even let go from Sick Kids because of all this. But long story short, eventually she did get reinstated. In 2016, Apotex was sued by Israel's largest generic drug maker, Teva Pharmaceutical Industries. Now, this lawsuit alleged that over a period of about 2 years that ended in 2016, a Teva employee copied company files onto a flash drive and passed them to Apotex CEO Jeremy Desai because they were in a romantic relationship. So that's just another example of a big pharma coming after Apotex, and by extension Barry. Those are just a few minor examples of some business enemies that Barry had. The list is much, much longer. Barry was also known for his political lobbying efforts. He supported the Liberal Party in Canada and had a couple of questionable encounters. At the time of his death, Barry was under investigation because of a fundraiser that he had held for Justin Trudeau in April of 2015, which was allegedly contrary to Canada's lobbying rules. Barry had filed a lawsuit in May of 2016 attempting to quash this investigation before it was finished. which was a legally unprecedented move in Canadian history. But if it had been proven that he was guilty of these lobbying rules, Barry would have been banned from lobbying for 5 years. Barry didn't only use the legal system in his professional life, he used it in his personal life as well. For instance, in 1996, after the Sherman's home was completed, the couple was dissatisfied with the work. Long story short, Barry and Honey filed 12 separate lawsuits against the contractors, and ultimately, they would recover almost the entire $2.3 million cost of building the home. I believe they recouped $2 million of the $2.3 million. But one of the most bitter and long drawn-out lawsuits was a 10-year court battle with his cousins, the sons of his late Uncle Lou Winter. Remember Uncle Lou, the one who owned Empire Labs, the one who Barry worked for as he went to university, the uncle who died unexpectedly at a young age and whose wife died 17 days later, and they left 4 young orphans behind? Remember Barry bought Empire Labs from the estate of his Uncle Lou, and that was Barry's start in the pharmaceutical world? Okay, so there is a backstory here. So when Barry finished his PhD at MIT, he and his best friend, as I've mentioned a couple times, Joe Ulster, they gathered the money and they bought Empire Labs. They eventually sold it, and in turn, Barry started Apotex. The rest is history. But when Uncle Lou and his wife Beverly had died, their 4 orphaned children, 4 boys, Dana, Jeffrey, Kerry, and Tim, were taken in by a Jewish family in the community. And I don't want to spend too much time going into their story, but in a nutshell, the boys did not have it easy. They faced abuse growing up, and as adults, the 4 boys, well, at least 3 of them anyway, fell on hard times with drugs. As children, the boys had lost touch with Barry completely. They had no idea by the time they became adults that they were related to someone who was so wealthy, though the boys did reconnect in their early 20s with their cousin Barry in the 1980s. Barry had helped them with everything he could. He was extremely generous. He bankrolled business ideas. He helped them pay for things like drug rehab. He was really trying to turn their lives around. One example is Barry helped his cousin Kerry start a renovation business. Now, Kerry says that he had this billionaire who wanted to help him make something of himself. And it started with a couple $100,000, and by a couple of years, it had ballooned into houses, cottages, sports cars, and it just kept snowballing until 15 years later of being about $5 to $6 million that Barry had given him altogether. Barry didn't only help Kerry, he helped all of his brothers. Unfortunately, Dana would not be able to overcome his drug addiction, and he did overdose and pass away. Now, most of what is known about this whole story with the Winter's boys comes from Kerry Winter, who has by far been the most outspoken of the Winter brothers. Kerry says that he did have a good relationship with Barry for about 15 years. They actually enjoyed spending time together. Things started to unravel when his brother Jeffrey found something out about the sale of Empire Labs. See, Barry had bought Empire Labs when the boys were very young, and the sale had come with that clause that when the children came of age, they would have the option of buying 20% of the company. But Barry had sold Empire Labs for $2 million, and he had used that money to help start Apotex, a business that would eventually be worth billions of dollars. According to the Winter brothers, Barry was not concerned with honoring the clause in his deal with Empire Labs when he sold the company. As far as Barry's side, the option with the orphaned cousins expired because Barry was no longer the majority owner. Now, I have to say, I do think this was very underhanded on Barry's part. What could he have done differently? I'm not sure. But I am sure there was some way that he could have done this without screwing the little boys out of their father's trust. Just saying. Anyway, when the Winter brothers learned about the clause, they felt cheated out of a fortune. Like they would, obviously. And they wanted their 20%. But since Empire Labs was gone, the brothers, they felt they had a right to Apotex, a claim that would have been worth about $1 billion at that time. And that was the basis of the lawsuit they launched against their cousin Barry. And the Winter brothers sued Barry for $1 billion. And obviously, this ripped the families apart. To Barry, sure, he had used the money from the sale of Empire Labs to start Apotex, but he didn't think the brothers had any claim to Apotex. Not to mention that he had given them all millions of dollars by this point and had done everything that he possibly could to set them on the right track, between drug rehab, setting them up with businesses, all so that they could make something of themselves. According to Barry, Kerry Winter was furious. He said that one day Kerry called him up all wild and said that he had figured out that Barry was only helping them out because he didn't want them to find out that he was involved in some conspiracy to deprive them of their inheritance in the 1960s. Kerry believed that the years of help from Barry was only to placate the brothers so that they wouldn't find out about their their 20% of Apotex that they were due. Now Barry said this was ridiculous, that he could have not anticipated that they were going to sue him, and that he lost millions of dollars helping them, and that somehow that would give him control over them. It really didn't make sense to Barry. In typical Barry fashion, once the Winter brothers sued him, he sued them back. He didn't just want the money that he had loaned them over the years repaid, he also wanted his lawyer fees to be repaid. Now, I could really go a lot deeper into this story, but that's it in a nutshell. Anyways, a long and acrimonious lawsuit followed and lasted for about 10 years. Barry wrote in his deposition that after Lou Winter and his wife Beverly died, that every time Barry went back to Toronto, he would go visit the kids to try to give them some sense of continuity. And they were his cousins, and he wanted to help them any way he could. The boys would not have been aware because they were too young, but this was around the same time that Barry bought Empire Labs with the help of his mother Sarah and his business partner Joel Ulster. And this would have also been when the infamous clause was included in that agreement. Kerry thinks that the clause was Sarah's idea, as a way to placate the trust, and Kerry believes this is when the lifelong conspiracy to keep the company out of the Winter children's hands began. You know, man, I can honestly say that I can see where he's coming from. I don't know if that means that he has any claim to Apotex, but morally, what Barry did there with Empire Labs and just completely leaving the kids with nothing, I don't know. It's pretty harsh. I can't believe that he didn't set them up with a trust or something. According to Kerry, all of the visits that Barry and Sarah made to them, there was never any mention of this clause, and that's where the treachery and the deception all began. According to Kerry, Barry might have been a shrewd businessman, but his mother, Sarah, she was twice as shrewd. Anyway, in 1967, the deal was done, and not much longer after that, Sarah, Barry's mother, died. According to Kerry, after Sarah died, he didn't see Barry anymore. And when the boys did come back into his life in their 20s, they were all sorts of messed up. But Barry did, like I said, he got them help, he got them into treatment programs, tried to talk to them, encourage them, and ask them what they want to do for their careers, and he tried his best to help them. By 2000-ish, Barry had given the 4 Winter cousins about $15 million that they all had used to buy, like houses, cottages, cars, businesses, and so on. So, the advances that Barry gave the Winter cousins were structured as loans, and once they started litigation against Barry, he sold all of the assets of the loans that he had made to them, including homes. But the real question here is, would he have done that if the boys had not sued him? Now, Kerry felt the loans, as I said, were just a way to keep the boys silent if one day they did find out about this clause, and the fact that Barry didn't make any provisions for them. Anyway, so the lawsuit was between the Winter children and Barry, but sources say that when the cousins sued Barry, Honey turned her back on them completely, and especially Kerry, who was spearheading this whole thing. Whatever affection Honey had for him, it was gone. Now, I could go a lot deeper into that story, but that's basically what happened in a nutshell. So after a long 10 years of fighting for what the Winter brothers thought they deserved, just a few months before Barry was murdered in September of 2017, their whole case was dismissed, and the judge who presided over the case threw it out and called their claim wishful thinking and beyond fanciful. Now, Barry had countersued the brothers, like I said, for lawyer fees, and he was asking for $1 million. So, I can see how Kerry Winter's name came up real fast in this investigation. And Kerry is, what can I say? Character. 7 weeks after their deaths, Kerry agreed to do an interview with the Fifth Estate, and it was a controversial interview. It was actually really awkward to watch. Kerry said, quote, Barry wasn't this loving, kind, giving money away, a pillar of the Jewish community. He cared about one thing, money. Making lots of it, not caring who he destroyed, who he stepped on, or who he fucked over, like me and my brothers. And he said that when he heard that the couple was killed, he said, quote, I don't believe it. He finally did it. I said he killed her. Obviously implying here that Barry had killed Honey and then himself. And he said he was so certain that Barry had done that because Barry had told him before in the past that he wanted Honey dead. This was years before. He said that when he and Barry were still getting along, that Barry had asked him to find someone to kill Honey. And he says that he did go so far as to hire someone to do the job, but Barry backed out at the last minute. Of course, Kerry had no way to back any of this up. It was his word against a dead man, and obviously if there was a hitman out there, he wasn't going to talk. So the Fifth Estate had Kerry take a lie detector test, and he failed it. Kerry also spoke with CBC where he said he would talk about killing Barry and was very graphic. He told the CBC that it wouldn't have been belts, though. He was going to wait in the Apotex parking lot, and when Barry came out of the building, he would be hiding behind a car and he would just decapitate him. He wanted to roll his head down the parking lot. Again, naturally, Kerry was questioned in relation to the murders. Now, Kerry's interview with police is sealed, so we do not know what was said, only what Kerry has said about it, and according to him, he provided the police with an alibi, and the police have told him that he is not a suspect. Now, there's a few other things that I just want to say about Kerry that I really didn't know where to put in this story, so I'm just going to say them here. Whether or not any of it's true or makes any difference, I don't know, but they stuck with me. So Kerry said that Barry was miserable. He says that Honey would ridicule Barry in front of him. He would ask Barry why he put up with this, and it was during one of these exchanges that Barry called Honey mean-spirited, and Kerry said that was the first and only time that Barry had ever said that. He asked Barry what it meant, and Barry called Honey mean-spirited in context of the children. Kerry also told a reporter with CBC that he had reached out to the children, 4 children of the Shermans after the murders, but they made their stand on the whole thing pretty clear. Basically, they said, you said all these horrible things about our dad, you said that our father arranged to have our mother killed, so basically, F off. Now, I got this from a podcast from CBC on the Sherman murders, and I wanted to mention it because this one really stuck with me. The reporter that interviewed Kerry said that when he was talking about this, his eyes went so black, like nothing that she's ever seen before. Anyway, Kerry said, quote, "There's going to be a reckoning. I've given them all the chance to come to the table. I've extended an olive branch, and I want to sit down with them and make peace. My brother Jeffrey's eating out of dumpsters at a fucking shelter. It's not about money. It's about Jonathan sitting with me and saying he was sorry for what his father did." Now, I'm just going to stop right there and say, what? Sure, Jonathan had not one thing in the world whatsoever to do with what Barry did. He wasn't even born yet. But anyways, Kerry wants the Sherman children to acknowledge the wrongs that their father did to him, and he wants them to create a fund like a hospital wing or something like that in his parents' names. Okay, so one final piece on Kerry Winter. On December 6, 2017, just mere days before the murders, the courts issued Kerry another blow. They ordered him and his siblings to pay $300,000 to Barry. Remember, Barry had asked for $1 million, but he was awarded $300,000. Now, that could be motive for murder. Another business associate and friend of Barry's that I wanted to briefly talk about is Frank D'Angelo. So, when Barry met Frank, he was a fruit juice maker who was trying to branch out into other businesses. They produced the Cheetah Power Surge energy drink together and started Steelback Brewery. And when D'Angelo Brands went bankrupt in 2007, Barry had lost $100 million. And something that nobody could quite ever understand is that Barry kept funding Frank and all his ventures and business ideas, even his filmmaking venture, long after, right up until the time that he died, actually. Even after D'Angelo was arrested on sexual assault and obstruction of justice charges, which were later dropped in 2009. Now, the only reason why I really bring up Frank is because most everybody in Barry's family and most of his friends have pointed the finger at him right from the get-go. I really don't think it was Frank, and I'll tell you why. Frank was a business partner of Barry's, and Barry had been bankrolling Frank's various businesses for years. When Barry died, Frank lost all his businesses. So that doesn't make sense. Why would he kill the person bankrolling his businesses? Not to mention that by all accounts, Barry and Frank, they were close friends. No doubt they were very opposite personality-wise, but regardless, they seemed to have a genuine friendship and cared very much for each other. And as I mentioned, nobody could quite understand this. Nobody understood why Barry always backed Frank, even when he cost him millions of dollars. And the one person in the family who seemed to have the biggest problem with Frank D'Angelo was Barry's son, Jonathan. See, when Steelback Brewery was failing, Barry bought in Jonathan to see if he could salvage the company. Anyway, throughout the jigs and reels of all this, Jonathan came to really despise Frank. He said Frank was a horrible businessman who was costing his father millions of dollars, and Jonathan could just never understand the relationship the two had. But I think it actually goes deeper than this, and that can be seen by some emails that Jonathan and Barry had sent to each other throughout the years. For instance, in one chain of emails, Jonathan asked Barry to help him understand why he continued to back Frank. Now, I think that Jonathan was jealous. He was probably jealous that Barry supported Frank no matter what, and maybe jealous that Barry and Frank had a great relationship, something that others say Jonathan did not really have with either of his parents. Though Jonathan was said to be closer to his father than Honey, Honey, I'm not really sure how close of a relationship he actually had with Barry. And I still think it even goes deeper than that, because around the time that these emails went out where Jonathan was questioning Barry's relationship with Frank and why he continued to fund his ventures, Jonathan had asked for a loan of $250 million from Barry to expand his businesses. And as far as I know, Barry didn't approve this request. So long story short, Jonathan couldn't understand why he, Barry's own son, who was an educated businessman, couldn't get the money. Frank could. Jonathan at this time even went so far as to suggest to his sisters that Barry was no longer competent to run his businesses. And this relationship between Barry and Frank would be questioned by nearly everyone in his inner circle. But over the years, many just chose to resign themselves to the strength of the pair's undeniable bond. One thing that I have never come across is what Honey actually thought of Frank. Seen a lot about what everyone else thought of Frank, but nothing about Honey. Regardless of how others may have felt though, Barry was very close with Frank and they were good friends. People say the reason why Barry always funded Frank was that he appreciated the fact that Frank wanted to make money. And Frank, he says that Barry supported his friends, and that's a fact. End of story. Jonathan has told the Toronto Star that he believes Frank D'Angelo was blowing millions of dollars, and he relayed his suspicions to the police that Frank D'Angelo was involved in the murders. Now, police did interview Frank, and like Kerry Winter, his interview is completely sealed, but he says that he was cleared. He apparently gave the police an alibi. So both Kerry Winter and Frank D'Angelo know that the finger was pointed at them, and that all of the information relating to their dealings with Barry has been turned over to the police. Both have been interviewed and provided alibis. Both say that they had nothing to do with the murders. The Sherman family had and still has its issues. So what? What family doesn't? I really haven't come across anything shocking as far as I'm concerned, but all that being said, the Sherman children are extremely private. It's been suggested that there was this idea floating around the Jewish community at the time the Shermans were murdered, that someone was targeting wealthy people of Jewish descent. So the children have never really spoken out. Jonathan and Alexandra have done a couple of interviews, but Lauren and Kaylin have never spoken out. But people wonder if this idea that someone was targeting wealthy Jewish people in the community had something to do with why people have never spoken out, because it's not only the children that have never really spoken out. Many of the Shermans' closest friends and extended family have never spoken out either, and when they did, they really didn't say a whole lot. It's like I mentioned, Kaylin and Lauren have never spoken out, period. And Jonathan and Alexandra have done at least one interview each, I think, and they have released a few statements to the media. Now, Jonathan did give some insights into family life, but Alexandra did not. Most of what we know about the family comes from other sources, which are extended family and friends, who, like I said, have also been reluctant to speak out. And it's their right to be private, but I do find it odd, because usually the family will be the first ones to want to speak out because they want to keep the story alive. They want to talk to the press because they want to keep the momentum going. But that has not been the case with the Sherman children, or any of Barry and Honey's closest friends and family for that matter. I actually heard Kevin Donovan of the Toronto Star say that in all of his years of reporting, he has never encountered a harder veil of secrecy. Now, I'm not saying that means anything at all, but it is different. Anyways, let's go over what we do know about the Sherman family to try and get a picture of how they were. And like I said, it's pieced together from outside the family mostly. I doubt very much it's the whole picture. Whether the relationships within the family were better or worse than we know, I have no idea. So when Barry and Honey were young, they wanted kids, like most people do. And they would spend a lot of time with their friends' kids. They even babysat Barry's friend Joel Ulster's children, and Barry was said to love to roll around the carpet playing with the kids. But having children wasn't easy for Honey. She had a series of miscarriages, but did eventually give birth to Lauren in 1975. Now, she's the only one of the 4 children who have both Barry and Honey as biological parents. After Lauren, the couple turned to surrogacy for their 3 other children, something that was relatively new at the time and not common in Canada. Using Barry's sperm, and in each case a different surrogate mother from the United States, the children were born. Now, Barry flew the mothers to Canada when they gave birth so that the children would have Canadian citizenship. Jonathan was born in 1983, Alexandra in 1986, and Kaylin in 1990. Barry was said to be a loving father, but often absent because he worked long hours at Apotex. Apotex, leaving most of the child rearing to Honey. So, like people have said, the daily duties of raising the children fell to Honey. But friends say that as the children grew older, it was Barry that they would call for help because the children supposedly did not have a good relationship with Honey. First, Honey was the authoritarian of the household, and there was a lot of tensions over money. Barry and Honey had very different theories on wealth and how to bring up their children. Honey wanted her children to understand the value of money and to work for it. She wanted her children to understand that money was for wants and not for needs. Barry, on the other hand, was much more likely to give the children money, and he freely gave money to the children, but supposedly different amounts for different children. So allegedly, he freely gave the two oldest, Lauren and Jonathan, a lot of money, but Honey had put her foot down after the first two and asked Barry to be more cautious with the younger two, Alexandra and Kaylin. And like I said, Honey was the authoritarian, and she could be tough on the children. Here's just one example. After Lauren's 7th birthday, Honey allegedly gathered up all of her presents and put them in a room, and she wouldn't let Lauren open them for several weeks. Honey's friends think that here she was trying to stop their firstborn from being spoiled. But as the children grew up, they seen their father Barry as softer and more empathetic. Even though Barry did have strong ideas about what his children should do, if they didn't do it though, it didn't change how he dealt with them. Now Honey's sister Mary has said that Honey was the mean one, and that Barry was the soft one, often doling out money to his children. Mary said that Honey said her children controlled her, and she referred to them as the Nazis. Honey also said that the pecking order in their house was Barry, the children, then her. And although Barry was often absent, he was said to be warmer with the children. And the relationship between Honey and the children was strained, and all 4 kids have said actually that they were closer to their father than their mother. According to an anonymous source who spoke with CBC, the relationship between Honey and her kids was not a positive relationship, and the kids spoke to Honey the way that Honey spoke to people that she didn't know, rudely. And this anonymous source said that the children were incredibly disrespectful to Honey. Now Honey wanted more control over the spending on the kids, and like I said, Barry was more along the lines of, well, they're my kids, and I have to give them what they want because that's what good dads do. And Barry felt that he should give the kids whatever they needed to try and succeed, whereas Honey thought that maybe we should not give them as much, or maybe they should work a little bit harder for it. Sources say that people referred to Barry as the Bank of Barry. Here's just a few minor examples of money and the kids. So Jonathan has said that his father gave him roughly $125 million to fund his self-storage business and a few other small businesses. But reportedly, that number is much higher. Lauren, the eldest, also received a lot of money. Friends say that they were told Barry gave her $100 million to invest in stocks and businesses. In comparison with the youngest child, Kaylin, who had been for years asking Barry to buy her a $60,000 car, an Infiniti QX60, Barry wouldn't give in to her, and he said she didn't need it. Now Alexandra, the 3rd child, she certainly did receive money, but nowhere near what Jonathan and Lauren did, allegedly. Now I can imagine that alone must have caused jealousy between the siblings. Now one of Barry's biggest dreams was for at least one of his children to take over Apotex, and he wanted them to work at Apotex and work their way up to management. But none of his children were interested, and he was really disappointed about this. While each of his children did do a short summer stint when they were younger, none of them continued on. They each took a different road. And Barry and Honey's 4 children did take their own paths that were all financially supported by Barry. Lauren became a yoga instructor in Whistler, BC, and described herself on her website as a counselor and therapeutic chef for people dealing with abuse or grief. Now, apparently she had invested money that Barry gave her over the years in businesses and the stock market, but with little success, according to family sources. Now, Jonathan owns a green storage business and operates a small marina and a cottage rental business. And he also has a real estate investment business called Harlow Capital, all funded by Barry. Now, Alexandra is a nurse who had worked in Canada's north with Indigenous children and in Toronto in homeless shelters. Honey wanted her to attend law school, but Alexandra had no interest. And in interviews, Alexandra has said that her greatest interest is in the Sherman family's philanthropy. Honestly, I did not find much about Kaylin other than that People had said that she had mused over opening a spin studio, and that in 2021 she had bought 50% stake in the Herzliya Ritz-Carlton in Israel, which apparently cost her $45 million. Now, when Alexandra did do her interviews, she didn't speak about Barry as a father, and she said nothing about Honey. What she did talk about was how much she looked up to her father Barry as a business leader with values and compassion for his employees. And in Jonathan's interview, he did talk about his parents, but really not a whole lot. Now, friends say that Barry had 5 children, and Apotex was his 5th child. And I guess you could argue that Apotex got most of Barry's attention. And to get a slight glimpse into how the kids may have felt about this, a string of emails that was shared by the Toronto Star shows Lauren telling her father something along the lines of, "I doubt making another $1 billion is going to make you happy on your deathbed. I bet instead you'll be thinking, I wish I had spent more time with my children." Something along those lines. Now, there are some reports that the Shermans' marriage was tumultuous, while others said that after nearly 50 years together, the marriage was typical. All 4 Sherman children reported that their parents had marital squabbles years ago, but in the months leading up to the murders that they were getting along very well. Now, who wouldn't squabble during nearly 50 years? Some close friends told the police that the couple, like many married couples, had their ups and downs. When seen in public, they got along very well, but behind closed doors, they did often argue, and it was often about their styles of parenting. Yet, the family dynamics have been described as dysfunctional. Actually, when this was put to Jonathan in his interview with the Toronto Star, he agreed. There were tensions over money, tensions over lifestyle choices, tensions over what the children were doing with their lives. And all of these tensions had allegedly resulted in years of therapy. And allegedly, this therapist would help each party rethink and often rewrite their responses before sending it during a dispute to remove some of the sting. But Barry rarely ever took this therapist's advice. Now, Kevin Donovan of the Toronto Star has some emails between the Sherman family members, and I have to say that they do give a very different perspective on how the kids seem to speak to their father than what some of his friends may say. One example is an email exchange between Lauren and Barry, where Lauren accuses Barry of saying he loves them, but his actions speak otherwise. She accused him of hating Kaylin, and she also accused him saying that it was pretty obvious that you hate John now too. She went on to say that she despised the way that Barry felt about her and treated her, and that their relationship was not possible under the current emotional circumstances. Now, just to give some context here to these emails from Lauren, in these emails she's defending Jonathan to Barry, who was pissed that Barry was continuing to fund Frank D'Angelo's business, which, as I've mentioned, was a big sore spot for Jonathan. And Barry, in his response to Lauren, went on to say that she was accusing him, and it was very extreme, and that in his opinion he had no doubt been a loving father to all of his children, and that there was nothing that he wouldn't do to ensure their happiness. Also, around the same time, he wrote an email to Jonathan saying that despite any belief you may have to the contrary, I love you very much and always will. There is little I would not do to help you find happiness. I think it is essential that you understand that I do love you very much and want what is best for you, and that you cease making accusations to the contrary. Now, there also was allegedly tensions between Jonathan and Honey, because Jonathan was gay, and Honey did not approve. Neither Jonathan's long-term boyfriend, Andrew, or his now husband, Fred, felt comfortable around Honey. And it really didn't sound like Jonathan and his mother were very close, as he told police that he couldn't remember the last time that he had spoken to her. Another source of tension in the family, as I've mentioned, was Barry's continued financial support of Frank D'Angelo. Particularly for Jonathan, he did not support this relationship. Another source of tension was, allegedly, Barry didn't want to move. But at the time the couple was murdered, they were in the process of selling their home and making plans to build another house. According to sources, Barry wasn't really too keen on building this house, especially the price tag that was attached to it. And really he wasn't too involved with the building, except when it came to making decisions on very pricey items. This new house was Honey's pet project, and one of the builders of the new house said that Barry had told him that he didn't even want to move, and apparently this was a source of tension between the couple. And Barry wondered out loud why Honey wanted to build a big house when he probably had 10 years left to live. And in relation to family dynamics, in Barry's will, he left everything to Honey. If she would have lived, Honey would have controlled the lion's share of the estate, but in the event of her death, the estate was to be split evenly between the 4 children, which of course is what ended up happening. For a couple worth up to $10 billion, one would assume that they each had a will, naming beneficiaries. Now, Barry had a will, but Honey did not, which does seem very odd. I know it happens, but the reason I find it odd is for two reasons. First, many people say they've heard that when Mary said that Honey was supposed to leave her $500 million, other people confirmed this and said that they had heard Honey say the same thing. And secondly, an anonymous source who spoke to CBC, the same source who told CBC that her kids didn't treat her well, also told them about a conversation that she had had with Honey just prior to the murders. About a month before, this anonymous person said that she was talking to Honey one day, and they were discussing meeting up, and they realized they were both going to be in the same area at the same time, so Honey offered to drive her. When this anonymous source asked Honey what she was doing in this area, Honey told her that she was visiting a lawyer to make amendments to her will. The source also claims that not having a will doesn't seem to be in character for Honey, because she would have had a will, and she's adamant that they did have this conversation. But the fact is, there is no will on file for Honey. No way to know who she would have left her money to, and if there is a will, nobody has ever come forward with it. Not that I'm aware of, anyway. But with both the Shermans dead, the entire estate went to the 4 children. There was no money left for charity, which was very surprising, and there was no money left for anybody else, which was also very surprising. Since Barry and Honey were murdered, to say the family is a mess would be an understatement. I honestly don't even know where to start, and to think we don't know much about the Sherman family, and I get the feeling that what I'm telling you is really just the tip of the iceberg. But what I do know is instead of coming together in their time of grief, the Sherman children, extended family, and close friends are split. As for the children, the only Sherman couple still together is Jonathan and Fred. At the time of the murders, Kaylin was engaged to Jared Render, who was an electrician who got a job at Apotex after they began dating, and whom she called her shining knight. Well, they got married 5 months after her parents were murdered, but Kaylin asked for a divorce within 2 months. Jared allegedly received about $100,000 in a settlement, and apparently his postings on Facebook are quite angry. He says that Kaylin treated him like garbage, that the Shermans are all liars, and if the police want to find out who killed Barry Sherman, they should try and learn who he really was and who he pissed off. Lauren lives a quiet life with her son and husband in Whistler, BC. She wasn't married at the time of the murders, but has since. Alexandra has launched a music career and was nominated for a Canadian Folk Music Award. She's also pursuing a master's degree in public health. Since her parents have been murdered, her and her husband, Brad Krocek, have split up. For Jonathan, not a lot has changed since 2017. He still owns his businesses with Adam Pollan. He still operates his small marina and cottage rental business, and he has continued to grow his real estate investment business called Harlow Capital. In his eulogy at his parents' funeral, he vowed that he and his sisters would honor their parents by staying together, staying strong, and continuing their legacy of giving. He announced the creation of the Honey and Barry Foundation of Giving, which he said at the time he wanted their Aunt Mary to be head over. None of that came true. The proverbial shit has hit the fan, and Aunt Mary is on the outs with all 4 children. Jonathan actually told Aunt Mary in an email that he and his siblings had decided to keep her away from the charities and from family events. And this all happened not too long after the funeral, and things have turned so sour with the Sherman children and Aunt Mary that when Kaylin got married, Aunt Mary wasn't even invited. As for the Barry and Honey Foundation, it never got off the ground. In 2023, Apotex, Barry's 5th child, was sold to an American firm called SK Capital Partners. Reportedly, the 4 Sherman children received a total of $3 billion from this sale. Now that's just part of the disbursements that the children had received, and probably are still continuing to receive as the estate is wound down. Barry's best friend and sidekick at Apotex, Jack Kay, was fired by Jonathan a year after Barry died. Jonathan said it was because Jack Kay was micromanaging Apotex. His sister Alexandra said that the two, Jonathan and Jack Kay, were at each other's throats and fighting like 2 bulls. Now, I think Jack Kay was probably the one person who knew and understood Barry's vision for Apotex, but Jonathan had his own ideas. For instance, Jack Kay was insisting on continuing Barry's plan to invest $50 million to expand a Florida drug factory that Barry had purchased not long before he died. Jonathan did not agree with this, and in fact in early 2019, Apotex sold that Florida drug plant, and a Florida business journal said that the plant was sold at a loss of $12 million to Apotex. Jonathan also disliked Jack Kay's regular lunches with Frank D'Angelo. As I mentioned, Frank D'Angelo was a real sore spot for Jonathan. And Jonathan also didn't like that Jack Kay had moved into his father's office after the police tape came down in early 2018. Now that one I can see. Now, until he was fired, Jack Kay was one of the 4 executors of the Sherman estate, and he seemed to be very much in charge of his late friend's $10 billion empire. Now, I have to wonder if that's the real reason that Jack Kay was fired, because by removing Jack Kay, Jonathan had made a huge step towards controlling his father's empire. Jack Kay had too much control, and Jonathan wanted it. Tensions over who would control Barry's holding company, SureFam, began immediately after Barry died. Jonathan thought it should be him and his business partner Adam Pollan, who, P.S., Barry didn't like Adam Pollan. Jonathan's sisters said a big hell no to this idea. So the 4 trustees of Barry's estate were, as I've mentioned, Jack Kay, Jonathan, Alex Glassenberg, and Brad Krawcheck. Now, Jonathan has said that he had the unanimous support of his fellow trustees in firing Jack Kay from Apotex, but Alex Glassenberg has said that he was, quote, disappointed that Mr. Kay was not able to stay on with the Apotex group. And insiders say that once Jack Kay was fired, he was never invited to another trustee meeting, and he later resigned as a trustee and actually had to threaten a lawsuit to get a settlement. And in the wake of all these things, Alexandra became suspicious of Jonathan, which I think is quite shocking. Alexandra has said that she became concerned a year after the murders with decisions that her brother was making. Decisions, she said, which did not fall in line with the, quote, values and principles of their late father, who treated their employees like family. Specifically, Jack Kay's firing did not sit well with Alexandra. The kids had grown up knowing this man as one of their father's best friends. She also has said that Jonathan had said that he was suspicious that Jack Kay was somehow involved in the murders, which Alexandra has said was ridiculous. As for Jack Kay, he says it's actually silly for anyone to think that he had anything to do with the murder of his best friend and someone he had worked so closely with for so many years. And as time went on, Alexandra became concerned that Jonathan was, quote, power crazy and trying to take control of everything. He had even suggested to his 3 sisters that he helped them manage their inheritance, to which they all said no. According to Jonathan, he was simply looking out for them, since his sisters did not have the business experience that he did. But the sisters disagreed, and they stuck with Alex Glassenberg with SureFam. Now, Jack Kay has said that succession planning wasn't a big thing for Barry, but he often did news about one of his children learning the role of generic drugs, which none of them ever did. In comparison, Jordan Berman, an Apotex spokesperson, has said that, quote, Barry had developed a robust succession plan which he began implementing 5 years ago when he stepped down as CEO. From that point on until his tragic death, Dr. Sherman was no longer involved in day-to-day operations at Apotex, rather focused on some specific aspects of the business. Now, Lauren told homicide detectives that her father wanted both her and Jonathan to take over Apotex, but neither one of them was ever interested. But Jonathan and his business partner Adam Pollan did have their eyes on the overall Sherman holdings. So what was in Barry's will? Well, the estate papers list assets of more than $124 million. Though that number would not include the bulk of the Sherman fortune that was tied up in various holding companies, and Apotex was just one of Barry's portfolio. There were so many others. As I've mentioned, Barry was said to be invested in hundreds of companies. He had indirectly put $1 billion into a pharmacy chain, and he allegedly had cash that was stashed away down south in a tax haven. The financial press estimated Barry was worth $4.5 billion, but insiders say it was closer to $10 billion. Barry's will stated that should he die and Honey survive, she would have access to all, quote, net income from his multi-billion-dollar estate. So in other words, she would have control of his money. Barry asked that his trustees hold his entire estate in trust and pay, quote, the net annual income derived therefrom to Honey Sherman in quarterly installments. He also gave his trustees, quote, absolute and unfettered discretion to provide Honey Sherman with additional payments from his estate to provide for her comfortable maintenance and benefit as they deem fit. In the event of Honey's death, Barry directed his trustees to evenly distribute his entire fortune among his 4 children, but he asked that more than 40% of each child's share be withheld until they turned 35. They would receive 1/4 of their share upon turning 24 and 1/3 upon turning 30. Now, Barry's primary will was dated May 13th, 2005, but it was amended in March of 2017, just prior to his death, to change the trustees listed. He had previously named 8 trustees, including all 4 of his children, but in 2017 changed it so that only his son Jonathan Sherman, his son-in-law Brad Krawcheck, his business partner Jack Kay, and family holding company executive Alex Glassenberg were listed as trustees. Now, as I've mentioned, Honey did not have a will at the time of her death. With Honey and Barry both dead, the full estate, assets, and net income of holdings passed on to the 4 children. Strangely, Barry left nothing for anybody else and nothing for charity, which surprised a lot of people. Alexandra has allegedly said that her father planned to give most of his money away, and he wanted to give back, and she's not the only person close to the Shermans who has said this. Allegedly, Barry was inspired by other billionaires like Warren Buffett and Bill Gates, who have signed what's called the Giving Pledge, which is a promise by the wealthy to give most of their money away in their lifetimes. Now, Barry had never signed this, though Alexandra and 2 of his closest friends said that they heard him talk seriously about the concept. I also find it quite shocking that Honey did not have a will. I know it's not uncommon for people to do that, but we are talking about billionaires, and if she truly had planned on leaving her sister $500 million, as Mary has said, you would think that she would have had a will. It just seems very strange to me. We know that the police consider the estate a big part of this crime. To complicate matters further, the relationships between the trustees are a bit, what would you call it, complicated? First, there was the fiasco between Jonathan and Jack Kay, who, by the way, stepped down as a trustee. Alex Glassenberg is Brad Krawcheck's boss at Sherfam, and Brad Krawcheck is Alexandra's ex-husband. Well, they were married at the time that Barry had named him as a trustee, but have since split up. Reportedly, Jonathan and Brad are friends. Something happened about a year after the murders, around the same time that Jack Kay was fired, that made Alexandra believe Jonathan was somehow involved in their parents' murders. And since that time, Lauren and Kaylin have sided with Alexandra, meaning that there is a big fracture in the family. Now, Jonathan claims that Alex Glassenberg originally supported him, but has since sided with his sisters. He says, quote, Glassenberg has made them, his sisters, believe that if he walks out the door, we are all fucked. They are beholden to him. Now, the sisters say this is not true. They trust Alex Glassenberg, but not blindly. In his own defense, Glassenberg said that he has been, quote, carrying out my duties in the best interests of the corporation's estate and all of the Sherman family, including Jonathan Sherman. Now, during the COVID pandemic, Jonathan claimed that Alex Glassenberg was refusing to meet with him because he, quote, asked difficult questions. Now, Glassenberg's lawyer has said that wasn't true, that Glassenberg doesn't think Jonathan asks hard questions, and the reason that they didn't meet was because of the pandemic, but that they did have telephone and video conference meetings during that time. My take on this is that Jonathan is trying to make trouble for Alex Glassenberg, just like he did for Jack Kay. I think Jonathan wants control of Sherfam, which was the headquarters of Barry's financial universe, and to get it, he needs Alex Glassenberg out. Now, I've read that there was no one other than Alex Glassenberg that knew as much about Barry's financial world as Alex Glassenberg. Not to mention that he was handpicked by Barry to oversee this, just like Jack Kay was handpicked by Barry. Now, I could be totally wrong by saying this, but it seems to me that Jonathan has his own ideas of how he wants to take over. But to do that, he feels he needs to get rid of those who will stand by Barry's vision and be a thorn in Jonathan's side. Jonathan has also come out and said that his brother-in-law, or I guess ex-brother-in-law now, Brad Krawcheck, is siding with Glassenberg on business issues, and apparently he was going to court, Jonathan, for a, quote, oppression remedy, but now they are in mediation over the issue of control of Sherfam. I'm not really sure whatever came from that. Jonathan was clearly making moves to take over. I mean, according to him, he was the heir apparent. Was he really, though? Barry left everything to be split between his 4 children. If you ask me, Jonathan is on a power trip, just like his sister Alexandra had said. And according to insiders, if Jonathan had had his way, Adam Pollan, his business partner, would have also been one of Barry's estate trustees. When Barry was changing his trustees from 8 to 4, Jonathan had suggested Pollan as a trustee, to which Barry said, no way. As for his sisters, Jonathan claims that people are manipulating Kaylin, and as for Lauren, She knows she will be financially secure whether she puts in the effort or not. Now, one big sore spot for control in the family is over charity. Barry and Honey were well known to be big philanthropists. Charity watchers say the 4 children had agreed to continue the giving legacy, but there have been disputes amongst the Sherman children over where that money will go. While Jonathan seemed to be focusing on taking control of SureFam and Apotex, Alexandra took up the mantle of the Sherman charitable foundations. And in 2019, she refused to approve a $40 to $50 million plan that Jonathan and one of his business partners had to build a premium hockey rink. Jonathan said the hockey rink idea was a plan to build a premium facility to attract premium customers. And under the plan, apparently there would be a Sherman charity created to own the rink and that Jonathan would have long-term oversight of the facility. In an email describing the rink situation, Alexandra said the plan was, quote, definitely not within the budget or the mandate of our foundation, and not at all in line with my parents' philosophies. So in other words, a big fat no. At the time, she said she was presiding over rolling out the ongoing $60 million commitment that her parents had made to funding projects with the United Jewish Appeal. At Barry and Honey's instigation, and with their financial support, a major redevelopment of an old Jewish recreational and cultural center has taken place in the north end of Toronto, now called the Sherman Campus in their honor. Anyway, when Alexandra said no to the hockey facility, the already contentious relationship between her and Jonathan got much worse. Jonathan even disinvited her to the baby shower for the 2 children he and Fred were expecting through surrogacy, the surrogacies that Barry had paid for. Jonathan went so far as to suggest Alexandra step down from charity work. He wrote to her in an email, quote, I do have a big problem with the fact that you have taken control of the foundations, and now you won't answer my calls to discuss foundation-related things. I am not an outsider bugging you for money like the hundreds of calls we get. I think you should temporarily give up control of the foundation so that the rest of us can continue to operate and make decisions. Alexandra didn't agree, and she has retained control over the Sherman family foundations, as far as I know. At that time, Alexandra wrote to lawyer Brian Greenspan, who was representing the Sherman family at that time, that she didn't like that Jonathan was still pushing for the hockey rink. She wrote, quote, there are many parallels here. John was used to bullying my dad into giving him money. My dad would often ask John to take out financing for green storage buildings, but John would refuse and kick and scream until my dad gave in. I have been avoiding John since December 2018 when he and Adam Paulin made it very obvious that they are money-hungry monsters. Now, Jonathan has said that his sister and father had very different approaches to charity. He said, in his opinion, Barry was interested in the tax credits, while his sister just wants to give it all away. In addition to a Sherman family charitable foundation created years ago by Barry and Honey, each of the 4 children now has his or her own charitable foundation. Remember when Barry was murdered, Apotex had just lost a big lawsuit and were looking at paying a $580 million judgment, and Barry was asking Jonathan and his business partner Adam Paulin to get mortgages to help pay back at least a portion of the loan that Barry had given to them to start the business? Well, as it turns out, Jonathan and his business partner did not need to get the mortgages after all, because after the murder of his parents, the $580 million legal judgment against Apotex was reduced during a negotiation and later paid. According to Jonathan, when Alexandra started thinking that he was involved, she had hired a criminal lawyer, John Rosen, to push Brian Greenspan to end his private investigation and to give everything that it had collected to the police, which actually did happen in 2019. And with this private investigation shelved, Jonathan launched his own private investigation, but I haven't seen anything about that, so I'm not sure if anything ever came from that. Nothing that I could find publicly anyways. Now, Alex Glassenberg remains the caretaker of what the Sherman family has long referred to as the Bank of Barry. He is the president of SureFam, which is the family holding company. So another person that I wanted to briefly touch on was Jeremy Desai, who was the CEO of Apotex when Barry died. He was another person that Barry had personally headhunted and handpicked to be the CEO of Apotex. And just like Barry, Jeremy Desai was a scientist, so that enhanced their bond. So I mentioned the lawsuit from Teva Pharmaceuticals against Apotex. Well, apparently everybody wanted Jeremy Desai out of Apotex, but Barry stood by him and protected him. But once Barry was murdered, Jeremy Desai was out, just like Jack Kay. Now, I don't know if this fits any way, shape, or form into anything related to the murders, but I did think it was important to mention in relation to the story and the changes both the family and Apotex underwent after Barry died. It's like none of his wishes were honored, and the people he personally headhunted and handpicked to be his business partners were being shoved out the door. All but Alex Glassenberg. But if Jonathan gets his way, Glassenberg will be out too, and Jonathan is going to make a big play, I think, to take control of SureFam, Barry's holding company. In 2020, Alexandra established the Honey and Barry Sherman Legacy Foundation to honor her parents' memory and further their unfinished philanthropic aims. In 2023, Jonathan announced he was donating $52 million to the Toronto Jewish community so he could build the Honey and Barry Memorial Arena on the grounds of an existing Jewish community campus. It will consist of 2 NHL-sized hockey rinks and supporting facilities. So in other words, Jonathan decided to go ahead with his premium rink idea, but using his own money. In early 2019, the Sherman children got permission from the City of Toronto to knock down the house at 50 Old Connolly Road. The house was knocked down in May of 2019. In 2020, the North York land where the home once stood was purchased by, reportedly, a woman close by for $4.25 million. And the vacant lot went back on the market under a new address, 48 Colony Road, in April 2023. Now, destroying the house upset a lot of Barry and Honey's friends. Not so much because of the house, but because when the house was destroyed, it was said to be full of everything. But the kids said they just didn't want it there. They said it was no longer a crime scene, and they didn't want the reminder. Fine, I can understand that, but I have to say, to knock the house down when it was full of everything was weird. Almost disrespectful, especially considering how charitable the Shermans were. Why wasn't their stuff donated to charity? I listened to a podcast where one of Honey's friends said that she drove over to watch when she heard the house was being knocked down, and she was shocked to see that the house was full of everything from furniture to family photos, and that Honey's bedside table lamp was still on her nightstand as the walls were being knocked down. Anyway, one of the Toronto Star's episodes on their podcast, Billionaire Murders, involved a description of the inside of the house before it was knocked down by a man who calls himself the Urban Explorer. Now, he had snuck into the Sherman home at night to have a look around, and I guess this is his morbid curiosity. Anyway, he noticed that everything was still there. Reportedly, he was shocked because he was expecting the house to be more or less empty, but the house was full. There was even still beer bottles on the kitchen counter and an open bag of chips. And it was clear that someone else had been through the place. Everything in the master bedroom was overturned with massive holes that were punched through the walls. The contents of drawers were strewn all over the floor, and even in the main bathroom upstairs it had been ransacked. And he wondered how good of an investigation the Toronto police had done when he came across papers and post-it notes and a notepad on a desk in their office in which someone had written out events that were occurring in the days leading up to the murders. It seemed strange to him that such a thing would still be there and not in a room at the Toronto Police Service's headquarters along with other items of evidence. He also took note that most of the stuff in the house, including electronics, were from the 80s or 90s. The majority of it was pretty cheap and sometimes quite tacky. The ever-frugal Shermans. And he detailed how he did a quick run through the pool room and how it had a terrible energy. And then he heard the sound of the garage door opening, which was the same door that he had used to get into the house. And he split immediately. I wonder who the hell was coming in? Another explorer? Someone looking to loot the place, maybe? I can't help but wonder if someone was looking for something that they could not find. Remember, people said that Honey had a will. Nobody ever came forward with a will. I wonder, could someone have been looking for this will? 5 years after the murders, Alexandra put out a statement that the $10 million they had offered for information was still on the table. 3 days later, Jonathan put out his own statement and added a $25 million to the reward money, making it $35 million for anyone that had information that led to an arrest. Now, the Sherman children are not the only family members to be at odds. The extended family has also fallen apart. According to Alexandra, the whole thing is a shit show. Honey's best friend and sister Mary is completely alienated from the Sherman children, as well as one of her own children. What's it all about? Well, money, of course. Remember when Barry and Honey were first murdered? Mary immediately chartered a plane home at a cost of $20,000, which was an expense to the Sherman company Apotex, and that quickly angered the Sherman children. Mary showed up at Alexandra's that night, a little tipsy and telling anyone that would listen that Honey had promised her $300 million. The true number she would later say was $500 million, but she thought $300 million would be easier for Honey's children to swallow. It wasn't. Mary says that she is completely cut off from the family and she is devastated. She reported that one day, 2 garbage bags were FedExed to her house. They contained some old clothes and a few mementos from when the Sherman children cleaned out Honey and Barry's Florida condo before selling it. Mary says her family has PTSD from how they've been treated by the Sherman children, and the 4 Sherman children broke off contact with Mary pretty soon after the funeral. Now, Mary's spending habits were mentioned in passing in the police search warrant documents that have been unsealed. Honey's assistant told police that while Honey never spent much money on her credit card, quote, it was Mary who spent a lot of money at US Saks, and Barry was never to see those bills. But Mary has disputed characterizations of her as someone who lived off her late sister and her husband. And if you think all of that is bad enough, wait until you hear this one. The Sherman children are now in a legal battle with their cousins. 2 of Aunt Mary's children, their first cousins, Matthew and Rebecca Shetman, are suing the Sherman children over a trust that they say may be worth more than $500 million. They claim the administrators breached their fiduciary duties by refusing to share information on the trust and are asking the court to appoint new trustees. According to the lawsuit, Barry Sherman had established the trust in 2016 to benefit not only his own 4 children, but the children of Mary Shipman and the children of his sister, Sandra Florence. The trust's main issues were shares in a holding company called Shermco, which was meant to capture the growth in the value of SureFam Incorporated from 2016 forward. According to the lawsuit, SureFam is the family's main holding company, which once encompassed Apotex, which constituted the bulk of Barry's net worth. The trustees accused of breaching their duty that the lawsuit seeks to replace are Jonathan Sherman, Alex Glassenberg, and Brad Krawczyk. The Shetman siblings say these trustees have violated their duties by refusing to meet with them or share the trust's accounts, including the value of the Shermco shares, which they say may be worth more than $500 million. They say the refusal is due to a breakdown in the relationship between the 2 branches of the family. After the Shermans were dead, because Mary Shetman claimed her sister had intended to leave her several hundred millions of dollars, but because Honey did not leave a will, the Sherman children declined to give her the money. The Shetman siblings say the conflict between their mother and the Sherman children now extends to them, and they are now no longer on speaking terms with their cousins, which is affecting the disbursement of the trust. And in the years since the murders, they say they've received nothing from the trust, which they allege in their suit is because of the personal animosity between the trustees. The suit also says that the relationships between the trustees has become dysfunctional, and that various trustees are otherwise compromised. Jonathan Sherman is no longer on speaking terms with the other 2 trustees and has disavowed their communications. And the suit also says that Alex Glassenberg and Brad Krawczyk have encouraged and helped Matthew and Rebecca Shetman's brother, Noah Shetman, to sue them and their mother over a separate trust, which they say constitutes a conflict of interest and breach of fiduciary duty. So it's just a big shit show. Anyway, in this lawsuit, the first problem from the Shetman twins is that they really have very little information about the trust beyond a simple document that identifies the beneficiaries. Now, the lawsuit alleges that the trust documents identifies the beneficiaries as the 4 Sherman children, 3 children of Mary and Ellen Shetman, who are Matthew, Rebecca, and Noah, and the children of Barry's sister and her husband Mike. Also, grandchildren are supposedly identified as beneficiaries. The lawsuit says that attempts have been made by the Shetman family to get to the bottom of the trust information, but they've had no luck. One major problem the twins say they face is that Barry set up the trust as a discretionary trust, meaning that the 3 trustees can determine who among the beneficiaries gets what and how much. The Shetman twins argue that while the trustees are entitled to use discretion in distributing funds, they cannot do this on the basis of personal animosity. So the Shetman's lawyer has asked the court to order the trustees to provide a full accounting of the trust. And the lawyers that represent the Sherman side have told the Shetman family that there is no relevant accounting to be made. So the Shetman side wants the courts to step in so that they can see the accounting for themselves. And they also want the court to either suspend or remove the 3 trustees and appoint an independent trustee to oversee the trust during this litigation, because there's so much animosity between both sides. The lawsuit also says that evidence of animosity by the trustees towards the Shetmans is that the Sherman trustees actively encouraged Noah Shetman to sue his mother Mary for an accounting of a trust that she had set up. Now, that case is still before the courts, and Noah is not speaking to his mother and has not joined his siblings in the lawsuit against the Sherman children. So yes, not only are 2 of their cousins suing the Sherman children, one of Aunt Mary's own children is suing her. It's just a big mess. Hey everybody, just wanted to pop on here again to say thank you for the support. Please make sure that you keep an eye out for and tune into part 3 of the Unsolved Murders of Barry and Honey Sherman. I was really hoping that I could do this story in 2 parts, but it's not possible. But I do think that I can probably clue this case up in 3 parts, so keep an eye out for part 3. It still blows me away that anybody would want to help out, so for anybody that would like to make a donation, I have added a PayPal link on my YouTube page. Again, it is very much appreciated. It really does take a lot of time to put these stories and videos together. You can now follow Unjust Crimes on Facebook and Instagram, and I will put those links in the description of the video. With all of that business out of the way, please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. And until next time, thank you for your time and stay safe out there.